Welcome, welcome. I see folks are trickling in. Thank you for joining us. I know it is nice weather out. I appreciate everyone taking the time on a summer afternoon to learn about housing. We're going to give folks a couple minutes to join in. And as people are joining the call, we'll have a couple poll questions we put up just to get a sense of who's in the room and ask some questions and see where our audience is at. So we'll go ahead and put up our first question. How much does someone have to make in order to afford a studio apartment in Portland without being rent burdened? So being rent burdened is paying more than 30% of your income in rent. So we have some options up in the poll. We'll give folks a couple minutes to take a look and see what folks think. The question is, how much would folks have to make an hour to be able to afford a studio apartment in Portland without paying more than 30% of their income in rent? I've had about half folks answer. Give people 10 more seconds and then we will close the poll and see the results. Okay, so you'll be able to see the results on your screen now. The correct answer was $28.85 an hour. So most folks, more than 2/3, guessed that. Seems like we have a pretty housing savvy group in the room today. Next question, less trivia, more just to get a sense of who's here. We'll put that up shortly. What is your housing situation? So to get a temperature check, how many folks on the call rent versus own their home versus have another housing situation? Okay, looks like most folks have answered. We'll give 5 more seconds and then close the question and share the results.
Andreas, would you mind providing direction on how to use the poll audibly for some folks on the call?
Sure. So as polls come up, you should see a pop-up and then there will be multiple options for each question. You click the option that represents how you'd like to answer the poll, and then that gets sent in for us. So folks should be able to see the results up on their screen now. We have a almost even split between owning and renting, as well as just under 10% of folks having a different housing situation. We're going to put up our third question before we get started with today's panel. So what do the folks in this room think the primary cause of Portland's housing crisis is? Just answer which of these feels like the most important or the most accurate answer. Wages not keeping up with housing costs, insufficient funding for affordable housing, failing to build enough housing, private equity, and speculative real estate pricing. This is a longer question. We'll give folks 15 seconds to fill this out, and then we will get started with today's panel. And here we go. The leading cause, according to the folks in this room, say it's private equity and speculative real estate, followed closely by failing to build enough housing and wages not keeping up housing costs, as well as insufficient housing at 17%. So a pretty even split. There is no right answer. It is just helpful to hear what folks think. So with that, thank you all for joining today's call. Welcome to Policy Talks. My name is Andres. I use he and they pronouns, and I'm the board chair for Portland for All. Portland for All is a completely volunteer-run 501c4 nonprofit. The organization was born out of conversations that folks were happening with friends and neighbors who were concerned about the challenges that face the city, as well as all of the negative rhetoric about the place we call home. Portland for All is united in our belief that there is a hopeful, positive, and inclusive future that is possible for our city. And we know that will take all of us coming together and working to make it a reality. So thank you for joining us. For some of you, this might be your first event with Portland for All. I'm going to take a minute to share quickly what we do. We have 4 key programs as an organization. We hold community conversations, which are town halls planned by teams of volunteers. It helps us hear directly from people across town about the challenges they see facing the city and the ideas that they have to address them. We do monthly meetups in alternate locations throughout Portland to provide an opportunity for new volunteers looking to get involved and connect with folks who are leading our programming. It's a chance to have one-on-one conversations and talk about what you can do to help Portland for All and join this movement for a better Portland. Policy Talks, that's what we're doing today. It helps educate our community by bringing together a panel of experts like the ones you'll hear from today to address some of the critical challenges that we're facing. And then lastly, Portland for All is a C4, which means we're able to endorse candidates and promote leaders who are best equipped and committed to addressing the major challenges facing Portland. We know for some people that politics can feel divisive, but we also know that elected officials have tremendous power and the ability to make critical decisions about the world that we live in. We just launched our endorsement process for the city council elections, so you could read about our criteria on our website and help spread the word to candidates. All of our work is led by volunteer members. If this sounds like something you'd like to be a part of, please reach out to us at hello@portlandforall.org. One last thing before I turn it over to our amazing panelists for today's event. Portland for All is completely volunteer run. So to keep growing our reach, we rely on donations to support our work. If today's conversation and our programming more broadly appeals to you and you'd like to support it, we ask that you contribute with a donation in whatever amount's meaningful to you. And I'll put a link to that in the chat. So with that, we are ready to get started with today's panel. During the event, you can put questions in the QA that you'd like us to ask the panelists at the end, and as time permits, we'll go through some of those. So now I am excited to introduce our panelists. Dr. Lisa Bates, Mercedes Elizalde, Michael Anderson. I'm going to give them a chance to introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about who they are and what brought them to this work. So I'll start with Dr. Bates.
Hi, everyone. And Andres, you can just call me Lisa. I am at the Toulon School of Urban Studies and Planning as a professor here at Portland State University. My research, my community engagement, my advocacy is all centered around affordable housing, anti-displacement, and equitable development in our cities. I've worked with the City of Portland's Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, with the Portland Housing Bureau, been on a number of different kind of advisory and oversight commissions. And right now, our major project here at Portland State that I'm leading is Evicted in Oregon, which is looking at the crisis for tenants who are experiencing housing instability in the eviction process.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Mercedes, I'll turn it over to you.
Hello, everybody. Mercedes Elizalde, I use she and her pronouns. I'm currently the director of advocacy at Latino Network, but my engagement around housing and housing policy has been many, many years in the making, really starting when my own family experienced housing insecurity in much the same way that most families experience homelessness, lots of couch surfing and sleeping with other families. I think for a long time, I saw my focus of work around specifically addressing poverty and education. But ultimately, when I got into direct service, I saw that the kiddos I worked with who had stable homes, the work that we did just lasted longer, had deeper impacts than the families who were struggling with housing instability. So I've been there and stayed there. I've circled the policy table a couple of times, working on the government side and also working in community. And I really appreciate being able to be here and have this conversation with you all today.
Thank you, Mercedes. Michael, I'll pass it over to you.
Hey, I'm Michael Anderson. I'm a researcher for Sightline Institute. We're a sustainability think tank. I'm based here in Portland, but it's a Northwest organization. I came into this because as a journalist originally, I was covering sprawl. I was covering the county government in Clark County, Washington. And the two things that county government does in Clark County is sprawl development and anti-poverty, like execution. Or dealing with poor people in general through the lots of different ways. And I realized gradually that those two things were completely related. I talked to all these people in Clark County about like somebody's going through drug court. How did your life take this turn? And often it was like, well, my car stopped working and then I couldn't get to my job on time, and then I lost my job and my kid dropped out of school and I got started stealing stuff and I went on drugs and here I am. So anyway, at the same time, I was also watching my 20-something friends in Portland, many of whom did not have cars, leading very different lives in a very different situation. And I realized that, you know, there's some class differences there in many cases, but I've since learned it's much more complicated than this, but I got, I think, an intuitive sense of the fact that like there's some choice here in how we're building our cities that either helps people live more or less resilient lives. And so I've sort of been learning more from there about how this all fits together.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to kick off today's panel and get started with our first question. So the first question I want to put to the panel is, what do you see as the key problem or problems facing the Portland Metro when it comes to the housing crisis? Mercedes, do you want to kick us off?
Happy to. So I think one of the challenges that we have with both understanding the scope and scale of our housing crisis and how to fix it is that we oftentimes talk about housing in isolation from other parts of our system. You know, I think even in for Portland for All, like our housing and a homeless services conversation was separate, right? These were separate issues that we were facing. And I think we oftentimes talk about housing over here, and then we talk about education over there, economics over there, social services over there, as if these things aren't connected. And I think that actually helps us to do this thing that we tend to do, which is if some individual person doesn't have housing, it's on them, because we're not talking about these things as they're interconnected. So we get to then treat this like it's a smaller crisis than it actually is, because if we were to take it in context of our full social and economic conditions, we would see our housing crisis is much more devastating than I think we're really paying attention to. Ultimately, I think the commodification of housing is really what continues to drive this. If we want to continue to say that housing builds wealth for average Portlanders, average people in the United States, and that means that that housing also can't be affordable to the average person or the average household. And we continue to build our policies trying to hold on to that commodification while trying to squeeze in affordability and try to squeeze in abundance, when we really need to be pivoting and focusing on how are we building abundance and affordability, and separate from that, a question of how do we build long-term economic resilience once folks have that stable housing. So I think a big part of it is we're not really thinking about our housing as critical to all the other systems that we have in front of us. A lot of times this is what makes it difficult to build the kind of housing we need in the right places, the size of homes that we need for different family types. It also limits our engagement with choice around what other things we want in our communities and our neighborhoods, because we're continually fighting that commodification and continually treating housing as just like one of the widgets in our economic system that's building other people wealth, instead of thinking about it as a critical safety net that we should be investing in all of the time and making as abundant as possible. And so I think that's part of our key problem, is both how we look at housing in order to be able to build proper solutions. And I think the commodification of our housing market will continue to keep us in some degree of crisis if we don't face it head on.
Thank you, Mercedes. So really thinking about that interconnectedness of the issues and the tension between housing commodification and trying to make services available. Michael, same question to you. Key problems facing the region with the housing crisis.
The way I usually think about it is that we have two separate, distinct, but interrelated problems. We have a lack of abundance of how there just aren't enough homes for everybody who wants a home in places where people like to live generally. And we simultaneously have a lot of people who simply can't afford the basic cost of owning and operating a home under today's systems. And you can't solve this problem by dealing only with this problem, and you can't solve this problem by dealing only with this problem. You need to try to address both of these problems simultaneously if we're going to actually house everybody. Now, if we have more homes at lower prices, then the market can do better to serve those people who can work within the market, but we can't count on the market to serve everybody, and that's why adequately. And so that's why we need to also be helping people afford housing through either giving them cash or a voucher or access to a non-commodified home, as Mercedes puts it.
Thank you. Yeah, so thinking about that housing production and what we need to get that on track. Lisa, same question.
Yeah, so to not be repetitive to my colleagues, I would add a couple of pieces here. I think one, there is a very serious disconnect in the politics of housing as we scale down. We agree, I think generally, that Oregon doesn't have enough housing, that the region doesn't have enough housing. Maybe we agree that Portland doesn't have enough housing. But when you come down to, is there a lot in my neighborhood that someone wants to build a 4 to 6 story building on, suddenly we don't need that. We don't need that here. We don't need that next to me. And so that NIMBY, which I think is part of the Portland for All mission, is to address NIMBYism, continues to be a very serious problem, and that problem becomes more intense the further down the income scale that housing is targeted for, right? So when it comes to housing those most in need, that is the housing that is most likely to be blocked on the neighborhood level. I think secondly, that we are in a system, as Mercedes and Michael are talking kind of from two sides of the coin of the reality that we are in a market-based system in capitalism. That's this housing delivery system that we have, which means we have to rely on the private market to supply housing for the most part. We have a local development industry that ranges from reluctant to quite reactionary in their politics. And so all that sort of local NIMBYism is compounded by, for example, advocacy to bust the urban growth boundary and do nothing but greenfield, single family, exclusionary, high-end development, which is what we see in most other metro areas, right? Sprawling suburbs and deepening racial and economic segregation. And that's a model that quote unquote works for the home building industry. And that's why they lobby for it, to see the, multifamily housers who are consistently present in the legislature fighting tenant rights. And who, for the most, certainly we have some, builders who want to try new things, but, and large multifamily developers, commercial developers, but sort of that ability to be nimble, move, adjust, and build in the new ways that we need to build has been a slower uptake in this region. It's a small city, it's a small market, not a lot of deep pockets. And then I would say, lastly, just to tag on to what Michael was talking about, incomes. And this relates, I think, to this reactionary politics in our development industry. You know, we wonder, why are people who make their money from real estate currently and for the past 4 years talking about how Portland is a disaster, a sinkhole, and you know, a nightmare of downtown? Doesn't that harm their own investments? It's a little bit weird. But our economic development strategy in this region for quite some time has been to import richer people. And so this panic that there's not more people with high incomes and high education moving to Portland has to do with the fact that our whole strategy has been basically like invite gentrifiers, as opposed to a human capital, human development strategy for people who already live here. And, you know, certainly as an educator, I can see the implications of that strategy when it comes to preparedness for our young folks who are from here, growing up here, and longtime Portlanders and Oregonians, and, you know, newcomers who are not wealthy to be able to plug in and thrive here. And we're not going to move forward with an economic development strategy that's just like get people with more money, and that's how we'll handle the housing problem.
Thank you, Lisa. So really taking us from how the more local you get, the less people think there's not enough housing, to the challenges with our development market, to our economic development and the opportunities that are not created for folks who were born and grew up here. I saw someone put in the chat as well. Folks can use the QA function to add questions for the panelists to be asked at the end. So if you have a question and want to make sure we don't miss it, there should be a button at the bottom of your screen that says Q&A. You can type your question in there and we will receive those and collect them for the panelists at the end. So moving on to our next question. Community members, folks have been concerned about housing affordability for decades. Portland has been in a housing state of emergency for a very long time. How did we get here? What do we need to think about to hold context for what brought us to this moment? And we'll have Michael start us off for this one.
So I think, like all my answers, I'll be talking about one aspect of the issue. There are lots of angles to the kaleidoscope, but one thing that we did, I mean, it's a problem we create slowly, right? Through, I would say, deliberate inattention, a long-standing tolerance for underproduction and segregation, and those two go together throughout, as Dr. Bates was saying, and a lack of support for people in need that we were willing to tolerate. But the visible homelessness now, for example, is not just because we stopped sweeping or police differently, but nationally, the #1 predictor of the homelessness rate of a city is what is the price of market rate housing in that metro area. And that's because 90% or more of poor people live in market rate housing, like it or not, as Lisa said. That's not to say that, as I said, the market is the only way to solve these problems. And in fact, it's incapable of solving some of the problems. But we could have a healthier market if we had different rules, and we can change some of those rules. So the history, how we got here, some of the things that we did to get here, it's from 1924 to 1959 in Portland. There is a gradually expanding set of bans on apartment buildings, on fourplexes, all the way up to 4 to 6 story buildings, and so on, that started in the richest parts of town and then was gradually expanded to more and more and more of the city. And then in 1981, the year I was born, we banned apartments from a lot of close-in neighborhoods. And then in 1996, there was an effort to like reverse that in the close-in Southeast neighborhoods, but that was shot down by a big political backlash in close-in Southwest neighborhoods similarly around the same time. And all these, so there were consequences of all these decisions all along the way that hit the least privileged people hardest and first, but exclusion was prioritized anyway. And that's one of the things that led us where we are.
Yeah, thank you, Michael, for pointing out some specific local things, as well as I know there's a lot of concern and a lot of conversation about visible homelessness right now, and pointing out the tie from that to the market price of housing, I think, is an important reminder for folks. Lisa, we'll turn it over to you next.
So I think that one of our big challenges is that we do not, well, for one thing, we don't have a time machine. So it makes a lot of sense that it had people been building a lot of housing before people moved to Portland, that we would have more abundant housing now. And so there was like a challenge of trying to like counter the business cycle and like the way the businesses, any individual development business thinks about what they should be doing next. And that's what planning is for, right? That's what urban planning is for, is to say things like there's projections and we can forecast and we can plan for things. But then we sort of run into the IRR on the spreadsheet, right? The rate of return. But I would say that, I mean, even that sort of framing where we talk about that is indicative of the reality that because of the system that we're in, we don't think about housing primarily from a person perspective, from the resident perspective, from the family perspective, even from the worker in the sector perspective. We think about it from the business perspective. So when we've had a housing crisis, we've bailed out banks and lenders. We had a rent and potential eviction tsunami crisis during the pandemic, and we provided for people in the business of landlording PPP loans to pay their staff, mortgage relief so that they didn't have to pay their biggest cost per month, and emergency rent assistance at 100% of what they were owed on a lease. And sure, that kept people housed, but that wasn't really a support to people. That was a support to the rental housing industry times 3. We calibrate our policy assuming a certain rate of return for investors, right? So when we talked about inclusionary zoning in Portland, it was all based on the idea that no one can take any kind of a haircut. You get and all kinds of benefits from being in the system that we are in a for-profit business, and you can't give up a dime. We have to recalibrate the policy if you're missing a thin dime from your profit. And even our affordable housing industry is a business driven by tax credit investors and organizations that are looking for developer fees to pay their bills. It's their nonprofit housing development is not revenue free. It's it's a different kind of organization, but it doesn't mean that there's not money coming off of that table. And I don't think we talk enough about the family budget. We don't talk enough about the worker, the reality that people who are building our housing can't afford to live in a lot of the places that they're building or really in our region at all. And our communities and the kinds of community displacement and destabilization in really concrete ways. Because the second that we start talking about how to get there, we shift all of our conversation into what pencils on the spreadsheets. And so we don't have a really good way to get out of that into a more kind of social view for housing that I think would align more with what Mercedes was talking about in terms of the diagnosis of the problem.
It's really helpful. So reminding us like the specific ways that housing being financially driven affects people, and the lack of people-centered policy is really driving a lot of at least the government intervention and priorities when it comes to housing. Mercedes, same question. What would you add to how we got to where we are today?
Yeah, I think on the longer history side, I think a lot of people know, and it was shared, things around like divestment from HUD and redlining and how we limit access to housing for people who were, in a political sense, in a racist sense, considered not deserving of housing, or at least not deserving of a shortcut that could get people to housing that other people were maybe deserving of. And I think that it's important to keep in mind that history because it perpetuates to this day. There is a ongoing pervasive fear of like helping too many people, helping them too much, or helping people who haven't shown that they need it or they don't deserve it. And that's today. And so like that's a history that we're building on, but that is also something that's present in a lot of our policies today around who gets a housing intervention. There's an entire like questionnaire that we give people who are looking for housing assistance to determine if they literally score high enough. If their score out of, 26 is over 20, maybe we'll help you out. 1 out of 4 households who qualify for federal housing assistance actually get it, right? And we're like totally comfortable with that. The Congress keeps co-signing that policy choice every single time they write a new budget. In our shorter history, I definitely think it's important for us to think about who benefits from the constrained supply. I think oftentimes we're only looking at who is suffering in our housing crisis and thinking about how we address that on that individual sense. But we should also be asking ourselves who benefits from the amount of housing scarcity that we have, and who is benefiting from policies and systems that maintain that scarcity. Right now there's a few lawsuits in a couple of states against this property management platform called RealPage that is divorcing housing costs from their local economy. They're not charging local costs. They're not competing locally. They're trying to compete nationally. And so we're seeing a flattening out of rent across communities. I don't know why Portland or Oregon are not part of that lawsuit. I definitely think we should be, to get this tool out of our market space. I think it's really damaging the understanding the cost of housing, because at this point, property management landlords, like, how much of breaking even for them is actually profit. I work at a nonprofit organization. For me, profit is a remainder in my budget. It's not a goal. It's not something I work towards. My goal is to spend all of the funds that we have. But that's not true. For other folks, profit is the driving motivator. And so then we're finding these situations where we're trying to maximize profit at the expense of the public, as well as at the expense of maintenance in those buildings. And so we need to be thinking about how we're looking at housing as a basic infrastructure, like water, like utilities. It's really taken decades for us to get to this point, and it'll take a lot more time to get us out. I know there's already impatience with things like the supportive housing services measure. We gave ourselves 10 years to show results out of that, and by 6 months, people were exhausted that we didn't have out, results yet. And so we're still trying to dig through that and get those long-term sustainable commitments to making this work. Even to this day, 45 years after some of the first marches for housing affordability, housing stability, we're still talking about, to what degree do we really want to invest in that? What's politically feasible for us to put money into? And then, of course, it all kind of comes back down to, also, this is a social structural problem. But then there's also what happens for individual people. Like, it took us decades to get here. And for individual people, it also has taken them a very long time to end up where they are. I know for me personally, it didn't occur to me for a long time that I was moving so often, because moving so often was very normal for me. And me not even considering living in the same place multiple years at a time, because I thought the best thing for me to do was to always chase the lowest rent. Don't negotiate. I didn't even think to ask my landlord for a different amount than what they were offering me. The goal was to move, was to not settle too quickly, to always be ready for the next thing. And that created other things in my life around my own instability that I didn't recognize at the time, but I recognize more now as a result of how I grew up, as a result of moving a lot when I was a child. So when you see somebody who's like camping out in your neighborhood, it's not that they showed up yesterday. Like, it took their whole life for them to end up where they are. And it's going to take time for people to find stability and find community that they need to have long-term stability as well. So we need to give ourselves that time. And we also need to give our community that time to make these shifts. And we need to stay consistent with them. I think we see a lot of shifting of priorities. Like, let's try this pilot program, let's try that. And we don't tend to stick it out long enough to undo things that have been with us for a really, really long time.
Thank you. So holding that long-term perspective and acknowledging the ways that some of the things that we're okay with as a society, like means testing, feed into how difficult it is to solve this problem. So we talked a little bit about how we got here. Our next question is going to be about what specific programs and policies could help us get to the root causes of the problems we're facing with our housing crisis. Lisa, we'll have you start this one off.
Well, I think that one issue is we need kind of like long-term and immediate term and medium-term thinking, all of those things. So lots more housing supply in the market is like a longer-term issue, right? Abundance of housing supply is not going to come online today to remove, to make people not sleeping on the street. So we need to kind of do all the things at once, which is like immediate kind of emergency responses and sort of medium term and long term big picture thinking. We clearly need more housing here and in all of Oregon. Like there's almost no part of Oregon that doesn't need more housing. And we do need that. So some things personally that I would be interested in is more innovation around finance on the local level, local development banks, more kind of revolving loan funds. I have been a longtime advocate of acquisition and preservation strategies for naturally occurring affordable housing. We really don't do that very well here. It is much, much more cost effective to maintain the housing that we have than to build new units on the affordable side. And the vast majority of people live in non-subsidized, non-regulated housing, right? That Mercedes pointed that out, like 20% of people are getting a housing support. So we have to address the people who are just don't make a lot of money and live in like cheap housing. And figuring out what that is. I do think we need, of course, pro housing zoning and development regulations, but as much as possible to support non-market-based solutions like community land trusts, co-ops, tenant right to purchase, things that will set aside some of our housing, not exclusively for the lowest income people, right? We can't have like this bifurcation where there's like housing for people below 30% AMI that's like protected to the extent that that's protected by government subsidy, and then everyone else is just like on their own. This kind of like meso level, low to moderate income people who are in a community controlled, community owned properties, I think would be a really powerful tool for us. But I have to say, I think that one of the most important things that we need to have is more community organizing, more tenant organizing. We need to address the kind of power imbalances that happen, whether that is NIMBY homeowners and the neighborhood association are coming to, development hearings, whether that is corporate landlords who want to enter the market here, trying to game the state legislature, whatever the scale or level that we're talking about, we need to have the organizing happening for working class people, for poor people, for people of color, for tenants who are not in control of their own housing, their own neighborhoods, and therefore are not in full agency and control of their own futures. Including in some of the most like boring technical spaces, right? I was reminded just a couple weeks ago was the anniversary of this horrifying fire that happened, the Grenfell fire in London. It's an affordable building built by, in a private development scheme where, of course, private developers had lobbied to reduce the amount of fireproof cladding in buildings. And that building went up in an inferno and it killed a lot of people. So we have to be really careful about sort of capitulating to developers saying, this is what's going to pencil, this is how I can, get there. Like we have to hold the line on our goals for, safety, for health, for well-being, for climate action, for density, for transit orientation. And again, I think we do that with community organizing.
Thank you, Lisa. Holding the tension right in housing policy of needing to think long-term, but also to the short and immediate term, as well as a host of policy ideas, and then having to organize to counterbalance the influence of developers or folks with money who have power in the current system. Mercedes, same question. What should we think of to get to the root causes of these problems?
Yeah, so I'll share one that I think it's kind of my dream policy, which is trying to eliminate some of this commodification of housing by actually repeating some of the things that we've done with food. So food in our country is subsidized twice. It's subsidized in production, and almost all of it is subsidized. And then as an entitlement program, it's also subsidized on the consumer side, the SNAP cards, supplemental nutrition for needy families and things like that. So we subsidize it both times. In housing, we actually talk about that as a bad thing. So if we've subsidized the housing and people are using vouchers, they're like, oh, we're double dipping. How do we stretch this out? How do we spread this thinner? You know, when really we should be trying to do a ton of both. We should take that 1 out of 4 households and get that to 100%. And then we should be subsidizing as much of our housing production below the cost of production as possible all across the income spectrum. Now to get real with what we actually can do though. So we do need to be having regular funding available for the development of housing and different housing types. We tend to do funding availability based on like a cost per unit and the lowest cost per unit, which really gears itself towards kind of the most densely populated building you can think of, with studios, maybe 1-bedroom apartments. So it doesn't allow for that kind of variety that we could get with all this great zoning changes we've actually seen in our community. We're not taking full advantage of that if we're only looking at like cost per unit and trying to do the lowest cost per unit. So instead, I think we need to have kind of a global ongoing funding commitment to housing development to allow for some of that variety to pair with other funding sources. So we've mentioned the low-income housing tax credits, for example. One way to make the tax credits really, really powerful is to have really high tax liability for very wealthy people, because the tax credit is just that. If I have a tax liability because I make a lot of money, I buy the tax credits and then I have to pay less in taxes thanks to that investment. Right now, our tax credits are selling for less than 90 cents on the dollar, which means they get more credit than we get money for development. There have been times in our history when it was actually more than $1, but ideally this should be a dollar for dollar situation, which means we need to have high enough tax liability. So when you're out hearing messaging, which I'm sure you're hearing it all over about how people are fleeing our community because taxes are too high, we have to eliminate taxes, pass no new taxes, that kind of environment is really, really bad for tax credits. And that's our primary way of funding affordable housing. So we need to have a healthy tax liability to make the tax credits work. The Portland Housing Bureau is our local developed fund. The Portland Housing Bureau has effectively been dark for a number of years now because they don't have any money. They had some bonds and they spent those out, and then the city council just decided not to put any more money into the development arm of the Portland Housing Bureau. So we're actually seeing that department start to shrink. We're starting to see fewer staff, like they actually had to lay off staff. And so that's then when we do get another bond, or like, let's say we get, we pass another local bond, or we find some additional revenue through a tax increment finance, which I know the city is looking at a couple of those. We're going to have a delay because we're going to have to hire back all those staff that we let go because we didn't keep funding this. And then we're going to have a delay in the implementation of those. And that's a constant thing that we see. So we need a city council who is prepared to fund the Portland Housing Bureau every year, no matter what, forever, you know, and not think about this as we're trying to build enough housing for the last, you know, gap analysis that we saw, which is typically, again, what we do. We look backwards and we're like, well, we should have built 1,000. We only built 500. So let's pass the bill to build 500. And it's like, we're still not catching up. So we need to be doing that prospective engagement. We need to be constantly funding the Portland Housing Bureau so that they can keep building and keep contributing, because most affordable housing as well is built with a variety of funding sources. So there's never just one, like nobody is paying for the full cost of this. You've got a dozen or so different funders funding different components of this work. And if Portland has a local funding opportunity, it makes us very competitive in both state and federal grant applications. It also means the projects just happen sooner and happen faster. I also think we should be really thinking about eviction prevention as a much larger scale strategy. I think Dr. Bates has said this really well and has incredible research in this space, but like most people are evicted because they didn't have enough money. And if we're going to have a minimum wage that is not housing wage, so we already know, we've already committed that we're not going to be paying people enough to always be able to afford housing. We know that cost of housing is not connected to our local economy as much as it should be because of these kinds of equity investments and things like that. And we also know people have emergencies. So if all these things are true and we know they are true, then why are we making this a legal court issue where someone is filing in court instead of just filing with an eviction prevention office? And the eviction prevention office is the one who then pays that back due rent, and we just keep that going as much as possible. because that will then take about 90%, 98% of the people who are at risk of losing housing and eliminate that and not make it a legal issue. And then as we continue to move these kinds of policies forward around having enough money to build and then having enough money for people to afford housing, right? Again, getting that subsidy on both sides. Then I think we really need to be investing in what other long-term supports that folks need, and whether that's education, whether that's jobs, whether that's just building community, right? Having a community garden where you're building some friends, like that does amazing things for people's long-term stability and mental health. And we don't really invest very much in that. So I think that's where I'll stop, but I love this question. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mercedes. So many ideas there, but really deconstructing some of the societal assumptions we have in our relationship to our tolerance to subsidized housing, thinking of that systemically, as well as some of that immediate eviction prevention. Definitely important points to keep in mind. Michael, what are some of your ideas to address these root causes?
I was thinking at first, like, oh, I'm sort of like more of a work within the system person than Mercedes, but then Mercedes busts out with like some very specific policy proposals that absolutely work within the system. So I respect that. Let's see. So I think that fundamentally, one way to think about the issue of people, tenants and home seekers, first-time home buyers, paying too much for housing is that those groups of people need more power in the transaction. And the way that those people have more, I think the fundamental catch-all way to give those people more power is to give them more choices, give them the option to walk away from any transaction. This came up earlier, but like we can't do that without there being an abundance of options, more homes of all sizes for all the neighbors. And that applies to market rate and to below market. I guess it especially applies to market rate, but it's also, like I said earlier, it's not enough to just give people options, in existence. People also need to have the money to be able to make different choices, so that we do need to spend money. To get more specific about that, I do think that like the fundamental way to get more housing into existence is for it to cost less money to build stuff. And there's no real way around that. That is not to say that we should be removing all our rules about the cladding of the buildings and like let the buildings burn down to save money. That is to say that we should figure out what are the rules that we can actually live without. What are the things that are driving costs that we don't need to do? I see a car floating up there on the side of the screen. We could do without as high of parking requirements in much of the country. And Portland has done a great thing, I would say, by saying individual projects get to choose the right amount of parking. We are not going to mandate larger parking lots just in case people need them. Another thing we could do is we could let people share walls and roofs and land and pipes if they want to, which is to say we could allow apartment buildings on more of our land, specifically in the highest amenity neighborhoods with the least vulnerability. The close-in East Side neighborhoods are the focus of this campaign that I'm involved with, and as are others with Portland Neighbors Welcome, called the Inner East Side for All campaign, to reverse that 1981 decision and allow apartment buildings through those areas. But also, it won't do what we need just for abundance alone, just to upzone. We also need to be honest about like what are the costs we can save along the way that aren't going to have the consequences we can't live with or shouldn't want to live with. So that's a balancing act that requires a lot of hard policy decisions, but that's the way I think about the basic problem of abundance.
Thank you, Michael. So really walking us through both the importance of abundance and then the impacts that that could have on the housing crisis for all of us. We have two more panel questions before we turn it over to the audience. So if folks haven't put their questions in the QA, that is your chance. This next question is, we have passed as a region historic funding increases for affordable housing development. Why are we still seeing so many folks living outside? And we'll start with Mercedes for this question.
Yeah, I'm going to kind of build on where I kind of left off, which is that we have these boom and bust cycles with a lot of our funding schedules. So part of the difficulty is that we're building housing for the population of people that we thought was at risk of homeless like 5 years ago. We're doing that now, right? Because we're waiting for the next boom in funding to come, and then we're using old data to determine kind of scales. For a large part of this, I think, our elected officials, I think this is what people want. Like, there was a series of polls that were out there asking if we should do another bond, invest in more housing development. And apparently the answer was no, at least to anyone who, well, I haven't seen that poll, but like at least anyone who will tell me that they conducted one or saw the results, they're like, oh yeah, the voters don't want this. They don't support funding affordable housing. Because for the most part, the way we fund affordable housing is based on political feasibility, it's based on poll results. It's not based on how much housing we need. It's just not, right? So like I think that's part of what we've seen in these conversations oftentimes is this is how many units we think we can get out of this. It's not a conversation of how much housing do we need and how are we building a roadmap to get there. Given that this is a long-standing problem that really grows over time and has continued to grow over time, a lot of folks in positions of power are trying to find the short-term win. And it's one thing to say that we're engaging in like short-term, medium-term, long-term wins on a longer-term scale. But if every new person in a position of power and authority always is looking for their short-term win, that's usually where the thinking kind of stops. Trying to get through the next budget cycle, trying to get through the next election with how can I show a win, right? And I think that goes back to, I think something that Dr. Bates talked about was having that coalition of community support could probably help with that a lot, because community tends to have a longer memory if they have organized for something for a long time versus somebody trying to tell you in a newsletter, like, this is the win that I got for you all. So aligning some of our funding cycles better so that we're taking full advantage of when those multiple funds are available, and not going at this like one cycle at a time would also help us think longer and plan longer, given that housing development, even when all of the funding is on the table and all of the zoning is perfect, is still like 3 years out, right? So we have to keep in mind the amount of time that a lot of things take. And when we're talking about folks who are sleeping outside in particular, we have these different definitions of homelessness. One of them is people who are chronically experiencing homelessness. One of them is folks who are unsheltered. And a lot of times we tend to think of these as like the same group of people, and they're not necessarily. And part of that is because people move into housing every day. Today, people who were sleeping outside have moved into housing. I want everyone to know that and know that that's true and that you can carry that. People got home today. And also today, somebody who had a home no longer has it. And this is something that continues to cycle through. So when we say things like, why are there people still homeless if we passed all these housing bonds? It kind of underlines this unsaid thing that it's all the same people who are still homeless, or that we haven't changed anything in the community, when in fact a lot has changed. A lot has changed for a lot of people. But we haven't necessarily changed anything about the ways in which people come to experience homelessness, whether that's through extreme traumas like domestic violence or family disconnecting from young people and leaving them out on their own, or whether it's from things like, I just don't have any margin or savings account, and now I have these expenses I wasn't expecting. Healthcare is a huge one of those, that those things still happen in people's lives, and we didn't create an immediate catch net. So when someone is experiencing a traumatic event that might lead to them losing their housing, most housing resources won't even talk to you until you've already lost that housing. Even our eviction prevention system typically asks people to already have a notice from their landlord that they're going to be evicted before they can get those rent assistance dollars, right? And so that's waiting for it to get as bad as possible before we create access to the solution we have created. And I think that is why, even though we've passed a lot of these bonds and we've built a lot of this housing, we continue to see it, because it's new folks, it's new experiences, it's things that keep coming into our system. And as we continue to build housing, we need to get to that point of really great abundance. And then we also need to make sure we're creating a social safety net that responds to housing instability before it happens. If someone knows that they're not going to be able to make rent, or responds within hours and not weeks or months, or Lord forbid, years.
Yeah, super helpful. Remembering how long that arc is and how long it takes to be responsive while recognizing that on a day-to-day basis, people's housing situation is changing. Michael, do you want to answer this question?
I ran some numbers one time and on the Metro housing bond, I think from a few years ago, and it added up to something like, under the rosy scenario for housing production, 5% of the total calculated need of everybody making under 60% of the median income. So it was never conceived on a scale, as Mercedes said, to be big enough to house everybody who needs help. And also, as Mercedes said, that's because if they had, it would have been 20 times larger, and then it would have failed at the ballot, probably. Does that mean it's like the best we can do? No, it's not the best we could do, but like that's the best we can do under that paradigm, under those conditions, and so on. So I guess I would say that there is no way that we can spend our way out of the problem entirely, but more money would help. We also need to be trying to find ways to do things more cheaply while also letting people live decent and safe lives. So that's the point I was making before, but in a different form, I guess.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. And for me, that stat was really shocking of holding that perspective that even combined, both the Portland Metro bond is just 5% of the need. It's really a drop in the bucket of the total thing.
But again, I don't want to downplay that. That's 5% of the problem, right? That's like thousands of people are benefiting from that and will continue to. It's good that we did it. Every little bit helps. Every life is a life, but like but if we're thinking about like, oh, when are we going to solve this problem? It's certainly not going to be with the kind of housing bond that we can fund on the ballot to build that type of housing for that many people.
Absolutely. Thank you. Lisa, same question. What should we be thinking about in terms of what we're seeing?
So I mean, I think this question is yes, it has to do with like the subsidized regulated affordable housing industry, and it also has to do with some other stuff about ourselves and our values. And so I want to talk about those things a little bit separately. So I would say that, you know, I remember reading, Michael, your stat and saying, oh yeah, that sounds about right. There is no way that the subsidized regulated capital A affordable housing system could ever possibly meet housing needs. Full stop. It's not conceived of as a thing to do that. None of those organizations have the capacity to build or manage such a portfolio, and I don't know why we would want them to. I have to be real sorry to share that capital A affordable housing providers are among the worst evicting landlords in our region. So if we want to understand why people continue to be unstable in their housing, we might start by asking, how is it that the organizations whose mission, including nonprofit organizations, whose mission is to house those people most vulnerable, most destabilized by all the experiences of their lives, cannot keep people housed, including for non-payment of rent, which, yes, I understand that as a business, including a nonprofit business, that bottom lines have to pencil and rents have to be received because there are investments and there are loans and etc. But people are not even safe from non-payment evictions in a subsidized regulated unit. It is also not a system which is, like, personally, I am not very invested in having more people engaging in like administratively organized and monitored systems of housing. So what I am interested in is how we move ourselves into more of a community control orientation toward housing, particularly in trying to keep people who are currently housed staying in the places that they are through not, through ensuring that the places that they live in are not getting sold to major corporations and national landlord investing groups and et cetera, but that we try to preserve through community ownership and community control and allowing people to create the places that they want to live in. And that is there's like some small financial tool blockages that have to do with policy and the way that we understand housing, particularly in the city of Portland, which is very oriented toward nonprofit development as the only mechanism for getting housing, not acquiring housing that's on the market, not preserving naturally occurring affordable housing, but we are going to put our money into the least cost efficient mechanisms for getting new subsidized units in with a particular set of developers who are not particularly cost efficient. That's a choice that we've made as a policy. We've also chosen to target income ranges that don't have a lot of flexibility for people who are like in a working poor situation or multi-adult households or mixed status and things of that nature. But the other problem that I alluded to around when we talk about like why have we invested this, but we still see people on the street is where we get stuck around this very intense politics of dehumanization. I mean, I'm genuinely very concerned about the state of our conversation these days about what is happening when we see people on the street and who is harmed by that. I am not experiencing a livability problem because people around, I look with my eyeballs and see someone who is unwell and unhoused in the street. That person is experiencing a livability crisis. I am not. And so I think not just in Portland, but throughout the West Coast, we're having a very serious problem with just an utter dehumanization of people who are currently outside. And it's really hard to build up a political will, whether it's to bond more or to really invest in a housing first model that, or a supportive housing model to really address in the kinds of infrastructure that we need for substance use disorder and dependency. Like we can't do that if we don't see human beings, and we don't see neighbors and community members. And that's something I feel some despair about, to be perfectly honest, is how we take stock of our compassion and our capacity as human beings to be in a human community with other people. And I think that is going to be a challenge for any steps forward if we can't start to directly address that politics of dehumanization.
Thank you, Lisa, and for bringing us in a way full circle back to where we started about the orientation to housing policy being about money and not people. And if we don't address that dehumanization and center human solutions like community control of housing, we're continuing to perpetuate treating folks as objects. We have one more quick question for the panel, and then we're going to jump into our audience questions that have been coming in. Last panel question: how do we talk to people about this? Folks who might share our values but are worried about the problems that they're seeing. They're receiving messages like the one Lisa was talking about, that they're being harmed by seeing homelessness, and they might be becoming impatient or skeptical with the problems and approaches we've been taking. Mercedes, do you want to kick this one off?
Yeah, and I think I'll start with kind of repeating something I said before, which is that like tens of thousands of people are being housed by the different programs and policies we have in place. So this kind of extreme narrative that like nothing is happening is just, it's not based in reality. So if you hear folks like saying that kind of thing, like really scrutinize where that's coming from for them. And be sure to know your numbers, like take a look. As much as there is a lot to be desired in more data quality, we do have reports from Multnomah County and the city of Portland on folks who are being housed through the different programs and interventions that we have. And I think it's important to keep that in mind, that this is a problem of homelessness continues to happen. Not that it happened once and we haven't solved it yet. This is something that's happening every single day and that we need to be addressing and investing in every single day. One of the kind of analogies I like to use sometimes is that it's like teaching third graders how to read. It's not that you want just this class of third graders to know how to read. You want every class of third graders every year to know how to read. And that's the same with housing stability. We want everyone to have housing stability all of the time. And so we need to invest in it and care for it and nurture it all of the time. I think there is a lot of fear-based politics out in the world right now. And a lot of people who are looking for positions of power think they're going to get there by telling you who to be afraid of and telling you who to blame. They'll tell you to blame folks for being addicted to drugs, that it's their fault that your life isn't as good as it should be. They'll tell you to blame immigrants and refugees for coming to this country to try to build a better life. They're to blame for why you don't have whatever it is that you want to have and you don't have it. Pushing back against that and demanding to know from people who want to be your leaders, what do they intend to build? How do they intend to bring people home? How do they intend to lift up our communities? It's not just a question of what you're trying to eliminate, what you're trying to reduce, what you're trying to get rid of. That's the talking point right now. That's what everyone is throwing at each other. And staying in that mind frame will keep you also in a deficit mind frame. You won't be thinking about what do I want to build and grow in my community. You'll start to think about all the things you want to eliminate and reduce. And that just takes away from building thriving, healthy communities. It takes away from you building relationships with other people in your world. I think it's important to keep in mind, I think I can't say it better than Dr. Bates did. So I'll just say that when we look at the population of folks who are experiencing homelessness, unsheltered homelessness in particular, we're talking about 1% of our community. Compared to when you think about how many people are housing unstable, about 50% of renters are rent burden, we're talking then about tens of thousands of people, but we put all of the focus on this one small group of people so that we can almost ignore the fact that actually probably the vast majority of us are living to some degree unstably, right? And don't have a ton of security in our housing. But if we put all the focus on a smaller population of people and demonize them, then I don't have to think about how on the edge I am or how close to the edge I might be. And pushing back against that narrative is in and of itself a radical thing that you can do, to say that I'm not going to talk about just who is to blame or who I should be afraid of. I want to talk about how we're making all of our lives better and how we're investing in that future that's long term.
Thank you, Mercedes, and reminding us the importance of pushing back on the rhetoric of divisiveness and pitting communities against each other, and remembering really to hold perspective for what we're facing. Lisa, what would you recommend?
Well, I mean, you're asking people who share values but are skeptical, and I'm both. As you may have noticed, I'm a little skeptical of the choices that we're making, and I'm not sure that we all share values. Like, I don't know that we share values. I actually think addressing the question of what are our values is really key and critical. So I want to know about, do we have a value that you can stay, if you're from here, you can stay here? Do we have a value that kids today should be able to live, have the choices and the capacities to live in the neighborhood that they're growing up in or another neighborhood around here? Do we believe that when, newcomers join our community who are not, tech, I'm trying not to be like derogatory in the way that I talk about people because everyone's part of our community. But, if you came here and you're not making six figures, like, can you be here, right? Do we believe that the people who are handing me a cup of coffee in the morning out of the coffee shop should be able to live and get to work in 20 minutes? Like, I can get to work in 20 minutes. And do we really believe that every person that we see that's sleeping in a doorway or that we maybe saw using drugs on the street is like also part of our family and our community, is one of our loved ones? And if we don't talk about those values, really talk about them, then we're not sharing values. We're not sharing values. And I think the difficulty is like, what do we do in the meantime, right? Before we have this like a transformative social movement where we all become in, like a part of our human family and transform ourselves. We have this like in the media, in the immediate term, this messaging that is still very much self-interested and very much about like financial and political efficiencies. Like housing first costs less money. Not evicting people costs less money because we don't have to pay for people to go in the social systems and go in the emergency room or be in jail or whatever. So like people talk about that quite a lot, like budget implications, or if you don't want to see this, then fund that other thing. And like I get it in the immediate term, but we have to actually cultivate different values. We have to actually cultivate in a deep way, a different way of moving forward. Again, this kind of immediate emergency situation into the longer term. We have to cultivate a path out of the idea that the only way I can personally thrive is for my property to own my own personal property, for that to generate wealth for me and my family, and to be entirely self-interested in what I see around me has to only benefit me in that financial way. That's going to take a lot because it's deep in our culture, is deep in our political system and our social hierarchies and structures. But to be honest, like because I'm a teacher and I'm here and I'm with young people all the time, I actually feel really hopeful about that. I feel like there are a lot of the students that I have, from young adults to like not as young adults, are thinking about and reflecting on their own experiences, their own life stories. Mercedes, you talked about that, like realizing like, wait, this is really what was going on, recognizing family members who are in different kinds of these crises, that they're, oh, my uncle is a person. He might have an opioid addiction and he's a human being that I love, and start to extend that to other people, as well as start to think about these bigger systems. So I do have hope that we can move into the right direction. But I think we actually have to talk about it. We actually can't imagine that everyone has the same values, because we don't.
Thank you, Lisa. So important of needing to take that step back and not just assume that we're on the same page, but really have conversations about what we're valuing and prioritizing, and how that's taking shape in the decisions and policies we make. Michael?
Yeah, good points. I think we're also stuck in an election where the median voter doesn't have as much power as they used to have under our new system. There are going to be lots of different median voters, and we're all going to have people somewhat like us to hash it out on the council against each other's perspectives. That's hopefully going to be healthy. But the I think for one thing that is probably pretty common is that a lot of people are frustrated because they feel for the people that they see with their eyeballs or know as their uncle or whatever, with what's going on. And I think it's important, when you want to be heard on these issues, to acknowledge that there is a problem. Just to say that like Portland is not working in all the ways it needs to work. That is completely true. A bunch of money has been wasted from time to time, and that's like, that sucks. Also, there's a bunch of money that hasn't been used yet. That's good and bad in different ways. But I think that like there are a bunch of common things that almost everybody's like, yeah, that sucks. But also like there are some practical ways we can work through that. Here are some things that are being done to make those things better. And we can do this if we want to, if we can find the right shared values. I think that's hopefully a hopeful message. I also think that a lot of what we're saying is in the general, I think most people benefit from a city where everybody has a place to live. Everybody benefits from a city with lots of different ways to live. And the like talking about the very broadly shared benefits of a city with plenty of housing of all different prices is not that alienating to very many people. Like most people want that city. So like, I think we can call back to the core things that a lot of people feel while we have the conversations that Dr. Bates mentions.
Yeah. Thank you, Michael, for bringing us back to how frustrated people are, but also holding that perspective and that need to keep moving forward and not get frustrated by that disillusion. So that's the end of the panel questions. We have a lot of audience questions. So I'm gonna throw those out to the panel one at a time. You do not need to speak to each question. If someone else covered it and you feel good, we can move on to the next. And then the faster we move through questions, the more questions we get to answer. The first question is asking about the effect of government development processes and fees and how that affects housing production, and if there are any specific codes or requirement or zoning constraints that are a barrier.
In the preliminary document to chat amongst ourselves, I mentioned Houston, and Lisa was like, as a planning professor, I am contractually obligated to hate Houston. But the fact is that houses cost half as much in Houston as they do in Portland. So we can hate Houston. We can say they do a bunch of stuff wrong in Houston. But if we're trying to think about like what is a lower bound of the like acceptable price of housing, if we came up with a bunch of rules to live without, maybe it's Houston, maybe it's Tokyo. Tokyo also does a good job at not having too many rules around development, and I'm sure there are downsides too. But like, that is a place of positive vision. Generally speaking, what I'm saying is the every single rule we make, every single rule we add to the system is another box and a check, and like another checkbox that needs to be checked over the course of the process of building it, and or another process that needs to be followed during the process of operating it, or whatever. And some of those are more important than others, but there's like a non-linear cost as those things pile up, and they all like have to be worked out against each other. And so the more of them we have, the more expensive everything becomes, and the more expensive each single rule becomes. So if we could figure out which of those rules really do matter the most to us, we should have those rules, and we should be subjecting every single other rule to like, do we really need that rule? Do we really need that rule? I think we need a skeptical eye on every single time we say, you're not allowed to live that way.
So I do have to say, it's not just that I'm contractually obligated as a planning professor to hate Houston, but very specifically, if you want to slosh up to your ankles every time it rains and you want every Black and brown person to be poisoned by industry, follow Houston's model. There's some very dire consequences to the way that they've chosen not to regulate building there. And I think that we need to be really careful about joining forces with folks who would like to destroy our fundamental land use system, because climate change is an emergency. I will say my favorite thing to talk about in the city of Portland specifically is remerging the long-range planning function of the Bureau of Planning and the current planning function that we have renamed the Bureau of Development Services into one entity that stabilizes funding on the current planning side. I think we have a very serious problem of like counter-cyclical layoffs in at the planning desk, in that because it's funded through fees. This is some real nerd stuff. They laid off 15% of the staff over the winter with not really very much of a peep, publicly, because the only constituency for Bureau of Development Services is developers. And like, who likes developers? No one really. No one really like that. No one loves to come out and sort of carry water for developers. But when the market goes down, then they sort of lay people off, and when they're trying to come back up and do stuff, which could be building the building I hate, but it's also building the thing I like. It's also renovating the building I want them to preserve. It's everything that involves permitting. They've laid off staff, and so it takes them till you get in the cycle and upswing to bring people back. So there's something that's a little funky about that, but it also makes it really hard to coordinate our big visions and our goals that combine anti-displacement and equity, climate action, housing abundance into a coherent, and I should say aging in place and access for people with disabilities, and combine that into a coherent program if we do not have long range and current range planning joined together and stably funded over time. So that's my local government nerd moment.
Thank you. Building off of that one, next question. We have a number of city council candidates on the call today. Are there any specific policies that Portland City Council could pass on its own that would help make progress on some of the issues that we've been talking about today?
So I'm going to jump in and say, build a plan to fund the Portland Housing Bureau every year forever. One of the places you could potentially look is that the city council actually has a policy in their budget where they set aside a certain percentage in a capital reserve. And so that is a pot of money that is set aside every single budget round. Housing is not considered a capital expense for the capital reserve. So you've got so you have like an in ordinance calculation for setting aside money regularly from the city general fund that does not include investing in housing. So that's a potential place where folks can look that as our city grows and we collect more revenue, therefore we should be building more housing. So we should take a percentage of that and put it into the housing. I think that's one kind of really direct way. I think another one is that the city council right now is just absolutely obsessed with shelter. They would spend every single dollar on shelter if they could at this point. And shelter is just a maintenance engagement, right? It maintains our current status quo. It tries to maintain it better. Shelters are an important thing. They're life-saving resources for some people. And I'm not saying we don't need shelter, but I am saying that if you put all of your eggs into the shelter basket, you're going to find in 12, 24, 36, 72 months that everybody is still homeless. So we need to be having a better balance. The city council has been pushing Multnomah County really, really hard to divorce itself from a housing strategy in order to prioritize a shelter strategy. A new council is going to need to bring a more balanced approach. And then because we were going districts, every district needs to have a yes in my backyard strategy. Every district needs to have a we want to build it here. We want money to build things here kind of perspective. Bringing that positivity to bringing that, because I think they're inevitably, I think Dr. Bates said it really well, is like as this gets localer, people push back against it. To the previous question, I think some of those areas are where we see housing development slow down the most, not necessarily just in the government fees and structures, but in the design review and all the comments that people can submit that will slow down or derail development. If there's nobody out there saying developing stuff in our community is good, because then developing stuff always seems bad. And it's not always bad. So we need that kind of positive narrative as well. Somebody leading their district and saying, we want investment here, we want to build things here. I think it's going to be really important for fueling whether or not there's money set aside to build anything ever.
Well, there's one place to get that money in Portland's general fund, and that is the police budget. So if we really want to talk about what we're doing for community safety, community well-being, and livability, we have to address the fact that vast sums of our general fund unrestricted money goes toward police overtime, police settlements, and police pensions. So I would say a more comprehensive conversation about how we understand community livability would be essential to any practice of moving funds toward more affordable housing.
Thank you.
I'd add one more. Right now there are 2 boards that oversee housing in Portland that have some discretionary power over whether projects can be approved or denied, and that therefore are subject to the NIMBYism that Dr. Bates started talking about a while ago. That, like, it's not, are you following the rules? It's, is this building good enough by our sort of opinions? But those are the Landmarks Commission, which looks at historic districts, and the Design Commission that looks at downtown and Gateway. Within those areas, those people have discretionary power to approve or deny projects, which opens those projects to a huge chilling effect and the risk that their projects will be denied. So people don't propose projects in many cases. The Landmarks Commission can overrule local zoning, can essentially overrule the council's approved zoning. They can say, no, that's too tall to be historic, that's incompatible because it's too big of a building. The Design Commission does not have that authority. They just have to say, no, this meets our guidelines for the area, or it doesn't. But they can't overrule the local zoning. If we could bring the Historic Commission, the Landmarks Commission within the same scope, then there would be less ability to overrule the council's approved zoning patterns. And there would be a lot less chilling effect when you build housing, specifically below market housing within historic districts.
Thank you for some very specific ideas. I think for time, this will be our last question. What do you think about alternatives to traditional housing like SROs and home sharing, and what is their role in addressing our housing crisis?
Personally, I would say I think SROs and home sharing are probably the more traditional form of housing. And like this single family home kind of environment is the thing we've created with all of the madness that we've created. I personally think I don't see a problem with different kinds of density models or home share models. It's been my preferred way to live for a very long time. I live in downtown in an urban space. I like living in apartments. I don't want to have a backyard. I don't want to be responsible for trees in the lawn. And I want to live in community and I want to have neighbors that are close to me that I can get to know. We do little events in our building and stuff like that. And that's the kind of environment I want to live in. I think what becomes difficult about SROs and home share are when we try to use them as like categorically qualified housing, like because you're homeless or low income, here's the housing unit you should live in. But SROs and home sharing are really community-based living, and someone has to want to live in a community setting like that to feel happy, fulfilled, and engaged in it. So I think we get into a problem when we try to make it part of like the permanent supportive housing where you're told you have like this is the housing you qualify for and now you live here and you don't have options, right? I worked in several SRO buildings with folks who are in recovery, a lot of folks who had like shared identity. We did group chores together, like it's just we did events together, like it had to be an intentional I want to live in this kind of way. Otherwise, people were like, they didn't like it and they were dissatisfied. They wanted something different. So I think it's a matter of choice and options. I don't think it should be something that is used in our affordable housing market quite the same way. But I do think people can find a sense of mutual aid and can find a sense of community in housing that has shared amenities.
Well, thank you. Oh, Dr. Bates, you're going to jump in?
Well, I was going to say, I mean, I would love to have us think about quote unquote non-traditional housing beyond just the question of its physical form, but also to the question of its ownership and financial arrangements. Like I'm more interested in having a conversation about cooperatives, co-ops, how we can bring, like income limited co-ops, community land trusts, and other forms of community and collective ownership into these spaces, whether they're whether you're sharing a kitchen or bathroom or not, but thinking about how we move away from only you're a tenant and you have no control over anything that's happening, which I would say is actually the bigger problem for capital A affordable housing SROs, is that you're a tenant and you have a manager that you're not in community with. Or you're a private homeowner and then you become a person who only cares about your property value, property taxes, and has strong wealth building incentives to keep your neighborhood exactly as it is with no changes ever, only wealth appreciation over time. Like it's figuring out how we move out of that dichotomy, I think, is more interesting to me to think about than like lots of people will want to live in lots of different styles of a building. But can we create a space for people to think about a different way to organize that would help more people to access that housing in the first place because they don't need $100,000 down payment to get in?
What an excellent note to end on. I really want to thank our panelists for sharing your time and wisdom with everyone. Thank everyone who jumped on the call for sticking with us, for giving us a weeknight of your summer. If you did not take copious notes, this is recorded and will be put on our website later so that folks can come back to it over time. Again, Portland for All is volunteer run. If you appreciated today's program, I put the link in the chat. If you could support us with a donation, that allows us to keep doing this work. We're going to keep doing our monthly policy talks through the rest of the year. So stay tuned as we continue to cover other topics. I'm sorry we didn't have time for more questions, but really appreciate all of you taking the time today. Take care, everyone.